What happens when saying yes to God doesn't open doors? It opens battles. What happens when saying yes to God doesn't open doors? It opens battles. When obedience doesn't part the sea, it stirs up storms. When your calling draws confrontation instead of comfort. Tonight, we're stepping into the raw tension of Exodus, the clash between divine purpose and human resistance. God sends Moses to Pharaoh, but instead of deliverance, the oppression gets worse. Sound familiar? From staffs turning into serpents, to a darkness so thick it could be felt, to a leader crushed between God's promise and his people's pain. This is a story about calling, courage, and what it really costs to walk with God when the pressure is at its peak. Whether you're in a season of waiting, wrestling, or wondering if God really sent you at all, this episode, tonight's episode, will meet you right there. Let's get into it. I'm so glad to be joined by my friend Jayla Smith. The price of this episode just went up. I'm glad to have her here. She's going to shed so much valuable insight from her perspective. And then we've got Pastor Miles coming back, Pastor Miles Young, Bryce James, who is no stranger to the podcast, Nate Honore, and we're going to be joined soon by Pastor Sean Anderson, who is also going to bring a wealth of knowledge to the table. I want to start off the discussion with this question. What does it take to break a hardened heart? What does it take to break a hardened heart? And at what point does conviction become defiance disguised as strength? This lesson really focused on that text that says God hardened Pharaoh's heart. And a lot of people have a lot of problems with that particular phrasing because they say, well, why would you say God hardened Pharaoh's heart? Well, as we saw throughout this lesson this week, it wasn't that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And so what does it take to break a hardened heart? And at what point does conviction become defiance as strength?
Well, I guess I'll start it off. To break a hardened heart takes humility, number one, to even acknowledge in the first place that your heart is hardened. I think the first verse that pops out to me, I'm so sorry I don't remember the reference, but it's in the Gospels when a man approaches Jesus asking him to heal his son. And, at the climax of the narrative, this man tells Jesus, Lord, I want to believe you, help my unbelief. And that's all it takes. So, and it takes a level of humility to even get there. So for number one, it would be humility to break a hardened heart. Humility, the love of God itself. And the second question, at what point does conviction become defiance? Very early on, we see that the Pharaoh digs in his heel because he does not want to lose his human capital. He does not want to lose the prestige that comes with maintaining human capital. He wants to keep his own empire, humming like a well-oiled machine, if you will. So very early on, he has set in his heart, I am going to defy the God of the Hebrews because I myself, the Pharaoh, am the only person that matters in this equation.
Yeah, I
go ahead.
I think the other half to that is okay, my bad. I think the other half to that Nate said is acknowledging that your heart is hard, and then I think the part to that is wanting to do something about it. It's easy for me to be like, oh yeah, I have a hard heart, but then if you're not willing to take any steps, to correct that, there's really no point in you acknowledging it anyways. It's kind of like, okay, it's almost like, you have a dirty car. My car's dirty. Okay, if you don't take your car to the car wash, or if you don't go outside and wash your car, what was the point of you saying your car's dirty?
That's a fair point. I agree. I think that question takes me to Paul's testimony. I think it's First Timothy, where he's talking to Timothy and he's like, man, I was out here persecuting caste, man. I was out here killing Christians, and it was out of ignorance. And then Christ introduces himself to him, and so I think when dealing with a hardened heart, I think we do need that introduction to Christ to show us, that our heart is hardened to begin with, so that we can begin confronting those issues.
Greetings all. Sorry, I'm just jumping in here. The difficulty with a hardened heart is, and I'm not sure if anybody spoke about this, is that because it usually takes time to build up, and so it moves, your heart gradually gets hardened. And so most people, or let me not say most, many people, by the time their heart gets to that point, it's very difficult, almost impossible for them to really see the wrongs that they're doing. And so God has to work through extreme limits to get the person to see. And even human beings, if we have a family member, even ourselves have become like that. Like, people have to go above and beyond to get our eyes to really open. And that's why I think sometimes we see people have some really outrageous conversion stories, because that's the only way God can reach them, because they're just so stuck in whatever direction they have decided to go in.
Yeah, I think I want to piggyback a little bit off of that. I think that just what I've seen in, I guess, my real world experience is that many people are not moved until something is knocking at their front door. I think we see that in reality, our current events. People believed or felt that, making a decision that they didn't think at the time would impact their own lives, once they realized, and therefore didn't curry any need for consideration of anything else or anything that didn't have to do with themselves. We now see that now that they realize that they are being impacted. Oh, I care about this. This is not what I thought I was choosing, So I think at the point where conviction then becomes defiance is, after being presented with evidence, facts, statistics, just reason and logic, and choosing to still show allegiance to that initial perspective and disregard whatever is being presented to you. I think that's when conviction then becomes defiance, disguised as strength.
And I'm so glad you brought out a parallel with today, because we could see there's a huge difference between Pharaoh and someone like Nebuchadnezzar. A lot of people will say, well, God sets up kings and sets them down. And they use that to kind of make the argument that whoever is in power must be God's anointed. This person is in power because God wanted them there. And historically, even before we had the United States, that's how monarchs really, justified their reign. God Almighty wants me in the throne. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, just like Pharaoh, came to a point where he was confronted with the power of God himself. And he was warned to humble himself. He didn't. He said, who could rival Babylon? Of course, this was the supreme power of his day. And right after, he has to be driven out of his kingdom like an animal. But then after the years he spent in the wilderness, he comes back and he's recognizing God's authority. Remember in the previous lesson where Pharaoh says, who is the Lord? Mm-hmm. Well, this lesson really could be entitled, allow me to introduce myself, because whether it be through the flies or the frogs or the Nile turning into blood, God is challenging the individual gods that the Egyptians turned to, represented by these particular things. And so Pharaoh, unlike Nebuchadnezzar, did not have that moment where he says, I understand that God is supreme and I'm going to, acknowledge him. In fact, we see defiance. We see that he says, fine, go ahead, just get rid of this problem. And as soon as the problem goes away, right back to his same self. But is Pharaoh the villain or a mirror? What parts of our own lives reflect the same stubbornness when God is clearly speaking?
Can I play devil's advocate, so to speak, in all of this? One of the things that I shared with my church was, back then the belief was, if a nation is defeated, it's not just a nation that was defeated, but the God of the nation was also defeated, right? And whatever nation won, it would show that they are the stronger nation and their gods is the stronger gods. So in Pharaoh's defense, so to speak, for 400 years, he had these people, he had them under slavery. They were praying to this God. This God didn't do anything to release them. So now he's saying, why do I have to do anything? Like my gods are clearly stronger than yours. I've had you all in slavery. Why should I let you go? I'm not going to bow down to a God of slaves. And so here he is. He's being defiant. You know, the way that I see it, even in life in this day and age, especially in the times in which we live in, one of the major rebuttals that I receive, you know, as a Christian is, you know, why should I follow your God? You know, look at all this going on. Your God, you know, hasn't done anything. So why should I serve him? And these are things that sometimes, I'm gonna be honest, like sometimes my face get rattled where I'm like, God, where are you? Like, look at how many people are sick. Look how many people are dying. Look all this going on. Lord, where are you? And so where Pharaoh is, a lot of times we see him as somebody completely out there, but there are many people today that is there. And many times even us in our daily lives, when we see stuff and we are confronted with our faith, sometimes we doubt and we defy as well.
And I think that's an excellent point, because it's so easy for us to condemn Pharaoh, because Pharaoh is confronted with what we would think of as just blatant, obvious signs that he's outmatched. The interesting thing too about this lesson is you would think that the magicians, to counter what God did, would kind of undo the plague. For instance, when the water turned to blood, wouldn't it make sense that they would turn the blood back into water instead of trying to replicate or imitate what God already did? And then it got to a point where they couldn't even keep up. You know, that they themselves were looking for relief from the boils and from these frogs. And it just goes to show you how man's efforts to substitute what only God can provide will always fail. It's so interesting to me that the Egyptians have to turn to so many different entities for different things. And it reminds me of how today, like, for instance, we may not pray to the god of flies or the god that has a cow's head, but we would go to the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones if we want to go to the altar of money. We would go to, dating apps and reality TV shows if we're looking for the god of love, or if we're looking for food. We have got so many, restaurants to choose from. Like, you choose. We could choose what we prioritize in the place of God today, just like the Egyptians did, is my point. And it's interesting that despite all of the evident, clear manifestations of his power, Pharaoh still tries to compete with God. And God in his mercy is having patience with Pharaoh. While all this is going on, God's people are covered in Goshen, untouched. And a lot of times, especially for young people growing up in the church, if all you know is the Adventist church, or if all you know is Christianity, there's this temptation to kind of like take off what makes you distinct and special and try to assimilate to what's on the outside, because you don't want to stand out like a sore thumb. You want to be able to fit in. You want people to be comfortable with you. You want to be able to, hang out with your friends in peace without this voice egging you in the back of your mind that you shouldn't be doing X, Y, And so what can you speak to on that, where what makes you unique and special is the very thing that people are actively looking to separate or distance themselves from?
I think that's good. I'm pretty sure it tells us that Egyptians at the end of the day left with Israel. There was some who slipped in, and so it's interesting because all this is going on. They're seeing, man, all of our gods are failing us, and not just the gods we pray to, but our very leader, who we have lifted up to be a god, who believes he's a god himself, has also failed us. And so I think that's something we can play with, where made them distinct was that they had a God who really went to bat for them, who fought for them and protected them. And at the end of the day, everyone else was, or other people were like, oh, hold on, how do I get in on that? And I think it's coming to realize that what makes you stand out, what makes you special are really gifts. The Sabbath, for instance. I used to be, when I was younger, man, the Sabbath came around, I was like, I can't go outside, I can't hang out with my friends, I can't do, and then my friends would hang out with me on the Sabbath, and the TV is off, can't play PlayStation, can't do anything, and I would get embarrassed. But it's like, I've been able, at this age, I understand the beauty of the Sabbath, where everyone else is overworked and they don't have a day off. Man, I'm trying to tell them now, yo, man, enjoy a Sabbath, take it for yourself. And so I think it's coming to realize it's not a hindrance, it's really a gift.
As someone who can absolutely relate to watching the clock and counting the minutes until the church bulletin said it was sunset, as if we were in Times Square waiting for the ball to drop, the salience of Sabbath as we get more mature is, something that does stick with me. I think also, Mike, to your question about Goshen, Goshen is land that was specifically set apart by Joseph and the previous Pharaoh for the Israelites. And another word that appears very frequently in the Bible instead of set aside is sanctified. So because the Israelites are in this, sanctified space, the hand of God is always, over them. Just, we're not there yet, obviously, but, as we get further into this story of the Exodus, we see the same protection from all kinds of the Israelites wander the desert. It's because of the hand of God that the Israelites are not prey snakes and other wild animals in the desert. It's because of the hand of God that the Israelites are able to hold their own against much larger nations in the desert, like the Amalekites, like the various other desert peoples. And so understanding why something is sanctified and the benefits of that sanctification are, hugely important for anyone who wants to be able to follow God.
And just going back to the magicians, was Pharaoh convinced, do you think, by the power of God at some point during this entire series of plagues, or distracted by the performance of his magicians? So many times today we could be distracted by our own efforts to substitute what only God can fill. We could be distracted by elevating certain individuals, certain things up to the platform of God, even if we don't outright say so. So do you think Pharaoh was convinced by the power at some point, or do you think he was distracted by the performance of his magicians?
Well, I think he was convinced, but I think the magic, as you said, provided a distraction. And I think even today we like magic. Like, we like the idea of a distraction that can numb us to the sobering effect of truth, right? We like only preach on certain topics, preach on the things that make us feel good, the things that already raise up our personal beliefs, but don't tell us that we need to love the immigrant or care for the poor. Don't tell us things that, is actually the truth. Give me distractions. Let me name it and claim it. Don't tell me that I need to start paying tithes so we can further the gospel. We like magic. And so I think Pharaoh was caught up. The magic gave him a way to avoid actually coming to the reality that this is an insurmountable God who is calling me out of my own wickedness, and I don't want to do that. So I think he was convicted, but he did lean into the distractions of his magicians.
I don't know if I would say Pharaoh was necessarily convinced as much as I would say he very quickly became aware, because you remember this whole episode starts with Pharaoh saying, "Who is the God of the Hebrews that I should listen to him?" In Egypt, we have the most powerful gods in all the universe. And, it gets to a point during the plagues where the court magicians stop being able to replicate everything Moses is doing and even tell Pharaoh, this is the hand of God at work. So even if Pharaoh is not fully convinced, because it takes a few more plagues before Pharaoh finally says, you know what, you guys can leave my country, he's definitely now become aware, okay, this God of the Hebrews is someone worth paying attention to.
I like what you had mentioned, Pastor Young, about distractions, because let's face it, today distractions are very attractive, especially in Christendom, right? You touched on a little bit, but think about it. How many shots have you heard against the LGBTQ community, which we know that lifestyle is not in accordance with God's will, compared to how many times you heard about how we need to love and embrace the immigrant, like you mentioned, and you just compare it just objectively, and you see obviously we're kind of picking up P's and Q's from, and I'm going to say it plainly, the evangelical world, where they pick certain parts of the Bible that they love.
Mm-hmm.
They love the part that's that bashes abortion, but they ignore the part that pertains to, they ignore the Beatitudes, for one. They ignore the part about welcoming the stranger. They ignore the part about the plight of the widow. And you see it reflected in how they align themselves politically with certain leaders. And even now, there's been a new effort to allow churches to endorse political candidates. And a lot of people in the evangelical world are like, praise God. Finally, we could help do away with this pesky separation of church and state. And as people of the book, as people of the cutting edge of prophecy, I think it behooves us to understand where this really is going, because we know that none of these things are in a vacuum. This is a particular trend towards Revelation 13 playing out. And I just wanted to put that in there, because even in the remnant church, we could be deceived, and you have so many people who get swept up in that frenzy of distraction. And even, if I were to look at, even the headlines today, you see how desperate some people who are in power are to throw distractions out to deviate from the fact that they are on a particular list. I just want to, I say that to say that some people have taken the bait.
Yeah.
Some folks have taken the bait.
I mean, you look at, I always laugh with my friends, and I say this: if for example, if Pastor Young goes up and says, next week I'm preaching on the love of Jesus, right? Nobody would pretty much bat an eye. Yeah. If he says, I have found a secret letter with information that the conference president is meeting with the Pope, or something of that sort, man, that flyer would be going out. I mean, people will be inviting people and saying, you gotta come to church. I mean, pastor has a. That's because, see, those type of things people love. I'm trying to find
sensationalism.
I'm sorry.
Sensationalism.
Yeah, that's it. People like those type of stuff. So when you preach truth and you preach solid things that people need to do, they don't want to hear that. Give them sensationalism. They will eat that thing up. They will share it on social media. They will do all of that stuff. That is the power of distractions.
Yeah. And I think that's very unfortunate. It's accurate that you say that, but it's also very unfortunate, because you don't hear too many people share on Revelation, right? You don't hear that no more. You don't hear about the 7 letters to the 7 churches. You don't hear, because with those particular churches, and I was sharing this with a friend, John isn't writing those letters to the state. He's not writing to government officials. He's writing to the church, which tells us that there's something going on within those 7 churches that Jesus does not like, so much so he has to save John from being a martyr, just so he can tell him, listen, you got to write to these 7 churches, tell them to straighten up, because there's something going on there that I don't like. And we'll dance right over that, because we don't like having to come to terms and look at and face ourselves in the mirror, because that's basically what it is. The 7 churches is basically us having to confront and deal with whatever it is that we're going through. Don't preach that. Preach something that makes me feel good, we say. Preach something that makes me go home and feel good about myself and give me a sugar pill. But the moment any pastor, anybody gets up and preaches on things that's going on in the church, or any serious issues, or even talking about the last days, oh my goodness, I will walk out your church and never come back. Pastor, why you left? Pastor preached something I ain't like. Well, what he preached about? Revelation. Well, that's something we need to know. Well, yeah, well, I just didn't like it. Well, okay, that's on you.
But and Bryce, to your point, they won't just walk out these days. They would go on their YouTube channels and
Yes,
start ranting and nitpicking at
and
things
and try to break down the sermon itself and be like, this is right here where the pastor said, oh yeah, no.
But this is the thing that's interesting, because we talked about it on this platform before, and I think that the Lord was specifically using her in that moment, and so many people missed completely what she was trying to say. And that was a few weeks back at the camp meeting down in Texas with Pastor Claudia Allen, and the theme was "Let It Rain." So she was literally telling you what are some of the adjustments that have to take place in order to have the latter rain, in order to have that. So to your point, people don't want to hear that. They want to hear, just continue doing as you're doing, and the rain will come and you'll receive it. They don't want to hear that there are certain things that make them unqualified for that pouring out of that latter rain. Because when you start to talk about the things that make them unqualified, it's things that they've become accustomed to and comfortable with, and they rather hold on to what makes them comfortable than to depart from that and make the necessary adjustments. And that's really what it came down to. Because when you look at it, not one of the critics that went to the internet were able to pull chapter and verse as to where she deviated from the Bible. I've listened to all of the different opinions that were shared, and she was able to quote, she used the Bible, and she called out, political and religious leaders of the modern church ignoring the plight of the afflicted and the impoverished, and people just got upset. And then you wonder, well, what was so controversial about this? Because if you were to take John the Baptist, calling out Herod in his day, how many of us would say, if John the Baptist transported to 2025, John the Baptist, why are you getting so political? Don't you know the king has supporters in the audience? You don't want to offend them, right? And so I'm just saying that to say that whenever there is someone who was actually ringing the alarm bell of things that we have to do to make ourselves and make our calling election sure, to make sure that we are ready to receive the latter rain, there's always going to be a huge backlash in the name of, and ironically, it's in the name of conservatism. Ironically, it's not the liberals or those who are on the fringe who are pushing back. It's those who have hold on to tradition and those who hold on to the way things have always been that push back. And I think that's an interesting parallel as we're getting into this. Any other thoughts?
Yeah. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I personally think that a lot of the issues that we see can all be kind of drawn back to just fear. And I just believe that fear is a symptom of the human condition. I think that in multiple arenas in life, we see people resisting a challenge, or I think one of the greatest fears for a lot of human beings is the concept of change, bringing something to my attention, challenging my original viewpoints and having me defend that. Right. That's a scary thing, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that's why we're seeing this shift towards conservatism, because that doesn't require a whole lot of stimulation. I'm just going to go ahead and do the thing that I've been taught day to day, and nobody's going to, no one will ask me, why do I feel this way? And if you do, I'm going to lash out. I used to be a substitute teacher, having, kids trying to get them to, practice a new math. We'll use that, for example, because I think that's probably one of the most disliked subjects. And the resistance that I would get, simply because it's like, oh, this is new, this is different, this requires application, energy. It requires me to learn something else that's unfamiliar to me, and that's frightening. So I think that, we see that kind of attitude from children to adults, at jobs, in the church, this fear of challenging the status quo. I think that is in my opinion, the ultimate, everything that we can draw it all back to that fear.
Yeah, those are excellent points. I had a friend call me today, actually, who's a pastor, and he was complaining because, you know, he has a congregation that, you know, has a good mixture of different generations, but it's the older generation that's the predominant one behind the wheel. And so because he has a heart for young people, he's trying to bring young people in, and he's dealing with situations where, you know, if the young people, for instance, on a afternoon during the weekday, not on the Sabbath, pick up the basketball, and, you know, they'll complain, you know, what are you doing playing the basketball in a fellowship hall? You know, like, look at how that person's hair is, or the way they're dressed, or the way they smell. So there's this tension that he complained about, and he's like, I'm trying to bring young people in, but when I bring them in, it's like the older members are chasing them out. And so I don't think that's unique to him. I think that's something that a lot of churches these days are experiencing, and it goes back to that hesitancy to abandon what the familiar that you were alluding to, Jayla. And so, you know, for especially Pastors Young and Anderson, I'd love to get your take on that dynamic where, you know, here we are trying to, you know, bring folks in who are maybe in Gen Z or millennials, and then the boomers, the Gen X, are the ones that are kind of like presenting a wall of resistance that discourages, is the word I want to use, a lot of folks who are younger from remaining inside, and preventing them from getting comfortable.
You know, I think we're reaping something that has been festering for years, and it's very hard because we're expected to fix it in maybe 4 years. We are in a church, which is very difficult. I think the main problem that we're fighting against is that our churches have never, or many of, let me say it like that, adopted a spirit of mentorship. And so our many of our churches have adopted a spirit of, if I am an elder, I'm an elder till the day I die, or I'm too sick to serve. If I'm community services, I'm community services till the day I die, or until I'm too sick to serve. And what we're seeing happening in our churches now is that these people that have hold the reins, that never thought they'll get old, never thought, they just thought they'll be young forever and just keep pressing on. They're getting older. They can't serve anymore, or they may die, gone, and no one has been mentored to take it over. So now you have this gap that's in the church, and it's just getting wider and wider. And what I've been telling my folks is that, guys, you have to develop a love in your heart for people, and especially young people. You got to learn to love the generation that's coming up even more than how you've loved yourself, because look, you're almost off the scene. You gotta ask yourself. And what I try to do is I try to make it real to folks. So this is what I say to folks: you don't want to see your grandchildren next to you in church. You don't want to see your nieces and nephews next to you in church. Literally, this is how I talk to us. You're comfortable sitting inside here, and your young grandchildren, nieces, nephews, wherever they are, they're not next to you. You're comfortable living like that. And so I try to start some sort of fire and open up their eyes to realize that they got to do something. Remaining the same will just lead to, at this juncture, just destruction.
Someone in the comments, I will say it's amazing to me how we assume that what we're talking about is lowering the standard. I don't think we have to deviate from the standards of God in order to attract young people. I really don't believe that. In fact, I will say that, you know, I got a lot when I went to Howard University, which is a secular institution. We would consider that the world. I found more people reverent about the Sabbath, and I didn't even openly tell them I was Seventh-day Adventist. They happened to find out, you know, on their own, and then, you know, things were spoken through the grapevine, and it was like, and as soon as any mention of an event or anything that took place between the sacred hours of Friday night to Saturday night sunset, like, you know, don't you know it's the Sabbath? They're defending the Sabbath. So I think that people respect when you are true to what you believe. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that lowering the standard is what we're talking about here. I just want to be clear on that, because some folks can say, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say bringing in the you know, worldly stuff and to make it more attractive. No, I'm just saying there's certain things that are just not biblical, like, requiring women to only wear dress. Like, where in the Bible can you tell me that it's a sin for a woman to wear pants, or for a drum to be played during divine worship? Or, I mean, I'm just talking about cultural things at this point, or things that that are not even salvific, right? Things that are just holding us back from entering the 21st century, as a church body. And go ahead.
And can I say this before, Pastor Miles? I'll let you go. But I just wish that we would just be honest and just have honest conversation and just say, listen, what I want is not biblical, but is what I prefer. See, that I can work with. I can work with that. But when it irks me when you pretend to say that the standards that you're referring to are biblical standards, right? And you're saying that we're lowering the standard, but really that's not what it is. What it really is I don't want to change what I've been doing all these years. It makes me uncomfortable. I don't like it because I'm comfortable doing it. I just wish somebody could, or many more people would just be honest, just say that. At least we have a place where we can start. But if we hide behind it and make it seem like what we are saying when we say let's embrace is lowering standards, then we can't get anywhere, because I'm in one world and you're in another, and we're speaking two different languages.
Mm-hmm. I got to be careful what I say. My members might be watching. That's a really good point. The comment from Tatiana. So David really wanted to build a temple for God. Man, he was gung-ho. He started preparing, and God eventually told him, you can't, because you've shed blood. You're a man of war. And so we see that God says, David, I can't use you because you were shaped in an era of warfare. Your mindset, where you came from, the era you were born in is incompatible with where I need to lead my people now. And so he has David pass the torch to Solomon. And I think a lot of our churches are at a place where, look, we had some warriors, man. Our church was built by some warriors, man. They were out there in the streets, in tents, fighting to bring people into the kingdom. They come from a warfare type of era. And I will never discredit them. I will never say their work wasn't important. It was very important. We would not have churches today without a lot of those old heads. But I think they approach the younger generation as if the same God that called them has not called the younger generation. And I think we have to get to a point where we can say God can use a new generation just as much as he used your generation, and trust that that same God will use them. I think the biggest fight for me in my churches is Sabbath school and dress. I wore jeans. I still wear jeans, and boy, I got some looks. I try to explain myself. Look, this is because I don't want someone to come in here and think that they can't fit in, and they don't want to come back. So if they see the pastor wearing jeans, they'll be like, you know what? I can come wearing whatever, and I can just hear the message. They didn't care about my thoughts. They didn't care about my rationale. It just broke tradition. They said, this Californian pastor has come to North Carolina. He's wearing jeans. Are you crazy? Are you lost your mind? And so I think it is, as you were saying, Pastor Anderson and Mike, we're confusing biblical standards for traditions. The second thing I had was Sabbath school. They want 9:30 a.m. 9:30 a.m. But you're going to see the same faces, the same people. All you guys are going to do is talk about the same things, and eventually it's all going to go to the 2300-day prophecy. That's not even what the Sabbath school was on, because it's the same people talking about the same things. When Sabbath school was built for new believers. And so why set it at a time that is unreachable by people who have not been shaped and developed? Why put it at that time instead of pushing it back so that more people can come in? And so I think we do have to fight very hard to separate biblical standards from traditions, because it does come to a place where that era of warfare, those traditions will end up hurting our church. But I'm gonna get off my high horse. I'm very passionate about this subject, so I'm gonna be quiet now.
And a lot of what you dealt with in your remarks, Pastor Young, was about leadership, But what does it say, going back to Pharaoh, about a leader who would rather destroy his entire nation than admit he was wrong? Does that sound familiar? you know, certain folks have built their brands around not apologizing, as if that's a sign of strength. And a lot of people have egged on that person and adopted their personality and been wrong and strong. And if you, unless you've been in a coma since 2015, you know what I'm talking about. We're seeing more blatant, more out in the open aggression, and all under this kind of banner of, I'm tired of being politically correct. I'm tired of being confined to these social norms, and I'm tired of having to be confined and respectful of people I don't, agree with in terms of their lifestyle. I'm tired of this. Let me just say what I want to say, and so a lot of people reward things like that.
Yeah.
So does that sound very familiar? Here you have Pharaoh. His whole it got to the point where the magicians are saying, "Look, just repent, man. Just go back to God and tell him you're sorry." They're acknowledging the supremacy of God. The magicians who were tasked with competing with God. And yet Pharaoh, despite the suffering he himself is also experiencing, it's not like he's looking at this from the outside and he's just like, sorrows and prayers is all I'll give to you folks. He's also experiencing the boils. Frogs are also coming out of his pantry, right? Flies. I remember we were at the campground a couple of years ago, and I don't know what it was like an epidemic with gnats, and I was there for the entire 2-week period working, and just to be outside for just 2 seconds, you just hear this. It is so aggravating. I can't imagine a swarm of gnats, let alone flies. You know how you feel when a fly gets in your house. You got to cover everything. It's uncomfortable. You can't let your guard down. A swarm of flies, frogs carry disease, and your cattle is dying. And yet, despite all this, Pharaoh is like, no, I'm not going to blink first. Is that familiar?
It sounds absolutely familiar, Mike. In fact, it's even a recurring theme, not just in the Exodus story itself, where Pharaoh continuously refuses to just acknowledge, okay, maybe I should just let these people go. But even throughout the Bible, a very funny theme happens, not just in scripture, but in modern history as well, where when you speak truth to power, and the chickens come home to roost for those in power, then you get blamed, right? Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let the Hebrews, the God of the Hebrews has demanded that you let them go," and Pharaoh says no. God shows why that he should be listened to and obeyed, and then only after untold suffering in Egypt does Pharaoh say, "Get out of my country." Fast forward a few generations to Elijah and Ahab, where Elijah says, "End the idolatry and recommit yourself to God," and Ahab says no. The consequence for that is years of drought. Elijah goes back to see Ahab, and Ahab literally says, "Oh, there goes the one who troubles Israel." And Elijah's like, "Wait, me? You're the one who's practicing idolatry." Or even like into the modern era, where we see 1967, Dr. King gives this speech about Vietnam about how it's just a humanitarian tragedy. And do you know what the response is from the White House? It's nothing but from the Johnson administration, it's nothing but condemnation. From other Black civic leaders, it's why you're going to make Johnson lose. It's not Dr. King's fault that Johnson was losing in '68. It's Johnson's fault for killing children in Vietnam. You know what I'm saying? This sort of, I am too proud to admit, too proud and too powerful. I'm too big to fail, almost, right? In Egypt, the Pharaoh is a semi-divine figure. And we see, this kind of veneration of the king, veneration of the state, veneration of the empire throughout scripture and throughout history, where I'm too big to fail, so I can never be wrong, right? In the 1800s, it's the papacy declaring itself infallible, right? To say, I speak for God, and, with terms and conditions, whatever I say is absolute biblical truth, right? instead of saying, you know what, maybe I got this wrong, but God is and God is more powerful than I, and I can step forward. And we do see moments of that kind of contrition in scripture as well. But more often than not, it's an outright refusal to say, maybe I am not the most sovereign individual in my life. And if you want to get even more recent, and go to current events, right? I can think of two examples off the top of my head. Number one is, the trade and free trade and tariffs have been a big issue lately. And recently we've been hearing all sorts of news about trade deals, and then the other countries in those deals going, wait a second, we're only on step one of talking about making a deal. We haven't actually cut any deals yet. Or even, when you talk about the more heartbreaking issues on the news, and one that is heartbreaking for me to see every time I turn on my phone is the tragedy and the humanitarian crisis of starvation in Gaza, where that was a very big salient issue last year, to the point of students risking their own bodily health and their presence in this country to say, this is wrong and we must stand up for it. And hearing that, and also reading in the news that the previous administration actively suppressed reports about oncoming famine in Gaza. There is plenty of, pride is a human condition, right? There's a reason that to come to God, we have to put away our pride.
Yeah.
And that refusal to admit when we're wrong only leads to more suffering down the line, not only for ourselves, but for people that we can't even think of. Even, or for example, with David, right? We talk about David and his sins. When David sinned against God by numbering the people, that was his pride in saying, I am this king, I rule over a great nation, it's time for me to build up my army. And for God to say, hang on, no, I am the ruler of this country, I am the one who calls the shots. And that's when David has to step back and say, you know what, God, I messed up, but what had to happen in between, right? A plague that killed thousands of people. And so when we move in our pride first and stay in our pride, the consequences are greater than we can imagine.
It's very hard to get a politician to apologize, much more a king. I mean, it's extremely, and just going back to the point of even with Palestine and Israel, I mean, I've listened to countless debates on this, and the argument would be brought forth that people are starving in Palestine, and then those that are defending Israel would say, but look how many we fed. And people would say, it's not enough. They would say stuff like, the people are lining up, you're shooting them while they're in line, you're dropping bombs on them, you suppressed food from them for months, they're dying. And they would say, yeah, but we were attacked first. So it's just this idea that and I guess, sometimes when people go down this rabbit hole, they feel that to apologize they've gone too far to apologize. And I think that is where some people's mindset are. We have already sacrificed so much. I'm already in this deep. Let me just plow through. And I think that's what Pharaoh is doing. I'm in deep. Let me just plow through.
What stands out to me with Pharaoh, right, is when Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And even when he tells the children of Israel, he finally tells Moses, listen, get out of here, go. I look at it as Pharaoh's heart wasn't even softened at that point. He was reeling from the loss of his son. And at that point, he was just like, get out of here. You got to dip. Because then he turns around, he's like, hold up. How are we gonna build all these pyramids? How we gonna build my monuments? Go get them, tell them to come here. So even then, I look at it. Pharaoh's heart wasn't even softened after, with all these plagues. God even tells Moses, "Listen, Pharaoh's heart is gonna be hardened, so much so, and then it's gonna get to the point to where he's like, I'm gonna do this, and I'm gonna tell, and Pharaoh's gonna say, I'm gonna drive. He's gonna drive y'all out." He never said the heart was gonna be soft. He was just like, listen, y'all, they got to go. They got to get out of here.
Those are excellent points. And when you look at Pharaoh himself, you're looking at someone who had more it just got to a point where he had more to lose by keeping these slaves than anything. And it reminds me of so many times in our lives when we're stubborn and we decide we want to continue down this path. This is the person I've chosen. I don't care how many red flags I've seen. That's a term a lot of folks, a lot of internet therapists love to use, red flags. I don't care how many red flags I've seen. I want this job. This is what I've told my family. This is what I want to do my whole life. This is what I set on since high school. I'm not going to change career goals now. I'm too late in the game for this. And despite all of the things that are happening around you, telling you change gears, you refuse. And Pharaoh is in that situation now, where the plagues are there. His own advisors are saying, boss, it doesn't make sense. Let's just throw in the towel. And yet he decides, I'm not going to do it. And only until it really hits home to a point where, and I thought about this, Pharaoh himself represented a deity. Each of the plagues, whether it be the swarm of flies, the swarm of gnats, the frogs, the Nile turning into blood, was a direct attack on a particular god Egyptians revered. But then in the last plague, I think that was a direct attack on the Pharaoh himself, because his successor, his son, was now the victim. And now he has no successor. So in other words, the limitation, the fallacy of Pharaoh is exposed. The Egyptians used to, famously put their pharaohs and bury them in these huge pyramids. Not just that, but they used to kill many servants to serve them in the afterlife, because they thought that when this person resurrects, they need to have their servants with them. They need to have just as much, pampering as they had right there in this life. So Pharaoh's son is gone. And so and Pharaoh is now forced to look at himself in the mirror as a regular human being, not as a god. And he has to, be taken down a few pegs. And I think that's important, because we may not be on the same level of Pharaoh in terms of our arrogance and pride, but we may have the same level of arrogance and pride as it comes down to other things. We want God to be we want him to have sovereignty over certain areas. But here, no, this is my jurisdiction, God. I have the final say here. And sometimes God has to remind us that he needs to be sovereign in all aspects, in all areas. And that sometimes is brought out by humbling experiences. Any thoughts? So how do we distinguish between...
There is a...
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. No, you brought out a good point that, we like to have God kind of be over our lives in certain aspects. And it's those times where, God has to do an about face with us and kind of be like, all right, you speeding, slow it down. But when it comes to, God, we wanted God to be over certain places. The times when God, starts to step on our toes per se, okay, now it's a problem. But at the same token, for those things that God wants us to really deal with, it causes us to have to look in the mirror and look at it, kind of like how Pharaoh had to do, where you said, Pharaoh had to look at himself as a human, no longer as the self-proclaimed deity that he wanted to be. And I think for us, it causes us, when God really comes to us, or we really try to approach God, that it causes us to really have to come to terms and face the reality of who we really are. And there was a statement that was made. Somebody said, we were all in Egypt at some point in time in our life, and God is calling us to come out. The reality of that is I believe we've all been in Egypt at some aspect, figuratively, and God wants us to come out of that. God wants us to come, but we have to want to come out of it ourselves as well. And I think it kind of goes back to in the beginning where we talked about Pharaoh's hardened heart, and sometimes we have the same issue, and it causes us to have to understand or acknowledge that yes, our heart is hardened, but what are you going to do about it?
Was this back and forth, this struggle, was Egypt's resistance really about theology, or was it just economics, politics, and cheap labor? And what happens when religion confronts profit?
Well, I would say it was about all of the above, because as we've mentioned, the Pharaoh is not only a secular ruler, he's also a spiritual one. But yes, also there was an economic slant to it. Don't forget that these are, slaves. These are literal unpaid laborers who are asking for their own emancipation, and facing resistance to that, not just on social and political grounds, but also on spiritual ones. Pharaoh's explicit reason, for not letting the Israelites go is because he does not know their God, and so he does not have to honor their God and let them go. But of course, it also benefits Egypt that Pharaoh has a workforce that he can literally grind into the dirt in order to build his granaries and stables. So it really is, in my opinion, all of the above, and that's why it matters so much that God literally, comes down and says, "I will deliver my people," because they're being crushed, they're being, exploited in all sorts of ways. But I can't let that stand anymore.
Isn't it interesting that every time religion comes into every time religion collides with profit, there's a distortion of God's image? And I think you alluded to it earlier, with Jesus in the temple. They're literally making money in the temple, and it's not just the fact that they're making money, but who are the ones that are subjected to the worst of the impact? It's the poor. The poor are not able to get the level of access that the rich are in the house of God. Now, if there's anywhere where the plane is level, it should be in the church. Correct. One of the things that was interesting, when we went to Oakwood, is that the professor that gave you a hard time throughout the week, when it came down to Sabbath, both you and that professor come down to the altar and ask for prayer from the same God, right? They may be the king in their classroom on Monday through Friday, but when Saturday comes, everyone is equal. And not just that, but look at the Dark Ages, folks climbing up the stairs with their knees until their knees start bleeding. And then you look at today, and you look at some of these lobbyists working with these politicians that claim to be enacting the will of God. Let's put 10 commandments in the classroom. Okay, well, let's save children from mass shootings. No, we can't do that.
No, can't do that.
Well, we can take away their health care. We can take away SNAP benefits and Head Start. That sounds about right. We can defund PBS and NPR. Programs that help children in their infancy and beginning stages. We can take away those things, but we want the 10 commandments to be front and center in the courthouse and in the school. And we see the hypocrisy of that blatantly. And I think it's no coincidence that every time religion collides with politics, that's the kind of image you see of a God that's interested in profit and a God that benefits the rich and at the expense of the poor.
That was a very, very powerful statement. You mentioned, let's bring the 10 commandments in the classroom, but we're not going to do anything about mass shootings. We're not going to do anything about the benefits that our kids are no longer privileged to have. So then what was the whole point of bringing in the 10 commandments in? Because the 10 commandments talk about loving God and loving your neighbor. If you're not willing to deal with the issues of mass shootings or deal with the issues of not having SNAP benefits or EBT or PBS or anything like that, then what was the whole idea of doing? You just took off the second half of the 10 commandments that talks about loving your neighbor. So if you're not going to deal with that, then what's the point of loving God? You just basically canceled out yourself. So now what's the point of you bringing in the 10 commandments? For formality? And there's already a issue about bringing religion into the classroom anyway. So somebody explain to me, if you're going to bring in the 10 commandments and they talk about loving God and loving your neighbor, and you're not going to do anything to help your neighbor, what did you bring the commandments in there for?
I think it's about control. I think we saw this during the times with like the indulgences and when religion was being used, or when profit was clearly a forefront consideration, for people's salvation. Buy your way into heaven, and if you don't do it this way, then you will be lost. And I think what we're seeing now, this push for, I guess, in many ways, disregard for human beings' autonomy and their agency and the gift that God gave us for our right to choose. I think it's about control. I don't really think it's a whole lot to it. I know you would probably dive deep into that, but I don't think that's the conversation for today. But I think, at the moment, the most important thing is maintaining a certain status quo for certain groups. Anything different is going to be deemed as wrong or bad. I think kind of going back to your earlier question, Michael, about rather when the statement was made, like, are we lowering the standards or are we just trying something new? Even when I think about, like, I'm a big music head, so when people talk about like 90s rap versus the rap of today, the young people like the rap of today or the music of today, the genres of today, but sometimes we'll hear in the background, older generations will be like, oh, well, y'all don't make music like we used to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the music is not good, right? We move through life, we progress, we change. That's just a matter of living. But again, I think, maintaining some sense of control over the status quo, not challenging the powers that be, it's easier, requires less tension.
I think also, remember in one of the Gospels, and again, I'm so sorry that I don't have the specific reference, but there, Jesus specifically rails against religious leaders who outwardly make themselves appear, holy and pure and perfect, but inside are, rotten and full of corruption. And I think that's, what we're staring at here when we talk about putting the 10 Commandments in classrooms and courtrooms. It's cosmetic, it looks nice, it allows us to think, wow, look how godly and pure our nation is. But what does it actually mean for a nation to live for God, right? What does it mean to have the 10 Commandments on the walls of the classroom if the kids are too hungry to learn? You can't learn when you're hungry. We've all experienced sitting in church before and not being able to remember a word the speaker is saying because all we can think about is the hunger in our stomachs. We've all experienced that. Those of us who went to Oakwood especially have experienced when it's, a special day and you had to rush to church to get a seat, and so you didn't eat breakfast, but it's somebody's anniversary, and so there's a whole bunch of people on the stage, and there's a bunch of special speakers getting awards, and before you know it, it's a certain hour, the cafeteria is about to close, and you still haven't had breakfast, and you don't know what's going on. You can't learn. It's not just about what goes on the outside, right? What did Jesus tell the woman at the well? It's not just about worshiping God in Jerusalem or worshiping God in Shechem. God doesn't care about the outward things. He wants your heart. And that's what the 10 Commandments in courtrooms and classrooms will never actually be able to affect. It will not actually touch your heart. Only you can give your heart to Christ, not the state.
And it's interesting, and I think each of your comments just shed light on the fact that when you offend the law in one way, but harp and focus on another, by default, you end up contradicting yourself. You end up just falling over. And I just want to play this clip as we're drawing to a close because I think it adequately conveys that. You had the Texas State House, this effort to put the 10 Commandments, I believe, in schools. And the irony is, they're doing this on the Sabbath. So I just want to play.
Well, the lady yields questions. The lady yields.
Thank you, Representative Noble. What is the fourth commandment?
Are you referring to my to the way it's written in the bill?
Yes.
Okay, right. Keep the Sabbath. It's about us being here on Saturday. Is that ironic or what?
So what does it mean to keep the Sabbath holy?
Well, I think it's, you want to get into theology here? I'd love to,
Just
if
curious,
you'd
yeah.
like to.
You'd love to get into.
And what day is it today?
It is Saturday. Here we are.
The Christian Sabbath is what day?
Sunday, in honor of the day that Jesus rose from the dead.
And we're scheduled to give this bill a final vote on what day of the week?
It's ironic, isn't it?
Would you be willing to postpone your bill so that we're not breaking the 10 Commandments by working on the Jewish or Christian Sabbath?
I love that you said that, because if we had not had your point of order the other day, we would have actually already completed that.
And so, Representative Noble, you're saying that you'd rather tell people to follow the 10 Commandments than follow it yourself?
I would have rather have had this bill passed the other day when it was time. And you know, that
there's a lot of tripping over yourself at that point. But I thought it was just an example of how hypocritical it is when you emphasize one particular aspect, and you end up breaking the other. I mean, any thoughts on that as we close?
That's
politics for you. Cosmetics. Yeah, politics and cosmetics. It doesn't.
Spirit and truth. That's what matters most.
Yeah.
And so, what do we do when obedience opens battles instead of blessings? When our yes to God brings resistance, not relief? We remember Moses. We remember the plagues. We remember a God who doesn't always remove the pressure, but never wastes it. A God who often allows the fire not to burn us, but to forge us. So if you're in a season where your calling feels heavier than your capacity, where faith is costing more than it's paying, you're not outside of God's will. You just might be right in the center of it. Keep walking, keep trusting, because the same God who allowed the confrontation is the same God who will bring the deliverance. Until next time, walk boldly, love deeply, and follow him. Thank you for watching the Escape Room podcast. That will conclude tonight's episode. Thank you all for tuning in.